today. I'm really heartened that there are 58 people who registered in such a short time for this book reading. Um, I'd like to introduce our co-facilitators for the reading, and then I'll give you a little more information. So we have with us Dr. Sherry Frazier. She is the Provost Emerita and Professor of Social Work at Concordia College in Bronxville, where she served for 36 years, and she just retired in June. After graduating from college in '77, Sherry accepted a social work position at Gary Neighborhood Services in Gary, Indiana. Dr. Frazier notes that her experiences in Gary provided the most meaningful education that she's received. Dr. Frazier's 3 children attended Tuckahoe schools from kindergarten through 12th grade, graduating from Tuckahoe High School in 1999, 2001, and 2003. We also have with us Reverend Dr. Michael Gerald, who's a graduate of Trenton State College and Princeton Theological Seminary. Dr. Gerald has a doctorate degree from Eastern University's Palmer Theological Seminary in the area of psychology of leadership renewal. He's formerly served as a law enforcement executive and is now the senior pastor of Shiloh Baptist Church in Tuckahoe, where he resides with his family. So if we could welcome our facilitators who are well equipped to have this discussion with us, and that I'm very excited to be joining us, and that they agreed graciously to lead us in this conversation. So some people are probably asking why white fragility? After the killing of George Floyd and the uprisings all over the country and even the world, a lot of conversations came up around race and social justice and injustice in Tuckahoe itself. And I think that emotions can run high when we start to talk about race. People become very uncomfortable. And I think that education is the key thing. In my discussions with Drs. Frazier and Gerald, they really highlighted how important that is, that it's about people being educated about what this all means. We're going to talk about, we're going to give some definitions. People have asked, what's the difference between white fragility and white rage? What's colorism? What does it mean when someone says, well, I'm colorblind? And so we'll get into some discussions. Keep in mind that we have 4 sessions that we're going to be going through this book. There are 12 chapters, so we will go through chapter 4 today. And then each week we'll continue with 4 chapters.
Thank you.
The 4th day, and I'll ask everyone to please mute their phones until you're gonna ask a question or make a comment. The 4th day we will have more of a broader discussion where people can ask some questions, make comments, maybe give some examples of their own life experience. So a couple of housekeeping things. Just so as I said before, we have 4 sessions. Each session will be from 7 to 8:30 p.m. until September 3rd. Questions may be asked in the chat bar or by raising your hand if you want to actually ask the question. In order to do that, you would go to participants at the bottom of your screen, and then go to more and raise your hand there. If you prefer to just type your question or comment in the chat bar, I will be reviewing those and asking the questions for you. Please keep your questions and comments short, as an hour and a half seems like a lot of time, but when you're having these discussions, it really goes by really fast. And I also ask that we remain respectful of each other's opinions. We're all learning and growing, and so we should keep that in mind. Also, mute your phones until you're called on to ask a question or make a comment. And I think I've covered everything. Anything I missed, Kaiti?
I think we are good.
Okay.
Yeah,
so,
thank you, Omayra.
Having said all of that, again, welcome. Please welcome Dr. Sherry Frazier and Reverend Dr. Michael Gerald.
Thank you.
Thank you. So as we approach this work, it is both timely as we are going through issues pertaining to race, equity, and social justice, not only in Tuckahoe, but also throughout the country. And so it is our task not to so much read the book to you. We presume that you are familiar with it in some way. We want to make sure that we cover a lot of the material from the forward through chapter 4, so that you could have a good idea what this topic and this work is really focusing on. And so it's my job to lead us through the forward, the author's note, and also the introduction. And again, 90 minutes seems like a lot of time, but the material is dense enough that it could chew up most of the time. So I'm going to try and be quick and concise and get us through so we can begin the chapters. And I begin in the forward because, it's important for us to understand the context, the full context of the work. And the forward of this book is written by Michael Eric Dyson, who is a sociologist and a professor at Georgetown University. He earned his PhD from Princeton and his undergraduate in Michigan. But he opens up, and he is the kind of academic who walks a fine line between the urban culture and the academy. And I want to talk about his presentation in the book because I think it captures some of the most crucial aspects of the Black condition. And as a sociologist, he's able to speak to the issues that bedevil Black Americans. And in the forward, he opens up by explaining that there are many metaphors for this thing called race and racism. He describes race as a condition, a disease, a card, a plague, an original sin. And he says something that really captured my attention. He said, historically, race has been Black culture's issue, while racism has been Black folks' burden. And that's a powerful concept when you think about the issue of race. And as we continue through the work, you'll begin to see how these concepts both open up and begin to provide some greater context for what we are talking about. And so he also makes a sort of a revelation that is striking. He says that whiteness has been constant and unchanging, which to me seems to suggest it's both ubiquitous as well as eternal. And in some way, it's the only thing that remains unchanged, no matter whether it's on, no matter if it finishes first or last, it still remains a powerful construct. And to that point, I just want to offer this little anecdote. One of my parents' greatest offering to me growing up was that, and this is a joke, so you could laugh or not, but one of the things that we used to say is that, in measuring ourselves in terms of how far we've achieved, we would say, such and such, whoever such and such is, you can be such and such, is still in the lead. And that's a way to describe how, it's been because of the constant of this concept called white and white persons seemingly always being ahead of every other culture. And that is something that is striking, and we can have a discussion about that. And he then uses Amir Baraka's metaphor called the changing same. He says it's a highly adaptable and fluid force that stays on top no matter where it lands. And academia calls this a social construct. And the social construct is an agreed upon myth that has most power when its very existence is denied. And he talks about how, you know, the greatest trick of the devil is to convince you that he does not exist. And it's almost like what, you know, this writer is talking, this author is talking about whiteness. It's powerful because it doesn't have to be named. It doesn't have to be outed. It's just a powerful force that does not even have to be acknowledged, but it still retains its power. And, you know, so I think this is a powerful introduction to the work itself. And on the second page of the foreword, this is what Michael Eric Dyson says. He says, Diangelo knows that what she is saying to white folk in this book is what so many Black folks have thought and believed and never said over the years, but couldn't be heard because white ears were too sensitive, white souls too fragile. That's one of the things that I think many Black people have grown up with, believing that, and when you read this book, you almost come to a conclusion that I thought that, but I wasn't sure until the writer begins to unveil some of the backstage conversations that happen only in white space and not in the company of others who are not white. And so Dr. Dyson goes on to just give a full-throated endorsement of the work and says that that Robin Diangelo is definitely an anti-racist thinker. And he says that white fragility is a generative idea because it causes us to think deeply about how white folks see themselves and whiteness and are so defensive about race. The fact that they try to escape the topic and act as if it's not a thing, but it's really a thing. And so that's the foreword. The foreword pretty much just gives a preview to what is to come, and it's, you know, offers a powerful endorsement of the work. And overall, Dr. Dyson says that this book is a book of its time and an idea that whose time has come. So that's the foreword. The author's note. Do you want me to pause, or we good?
It's up to you.
Okay. You want me to keep going? Are there any questions?
There are no questions out yet.
Okay. In the author's note, the author introduces this work by way of preface, and she makes it clear in the note to that precedes the actual introduction that she makes a harsh statement, and this is something that might give some people agita, but she nevertheless makes the statement. She says the United States was founded on the principle that all people are created equal. Yet the nation began with the attempted genocide of indigenous people and the theft of their land. American wealth was built on the labor of kidnapped and enslaved Africans and their descendants. So the writer is, from the beginning, underscoring America's original sin.
So I have a question's been asked.
Okay, Go ahead.
Why am I responsible for my ancestors' actions?
I think the writer would suggest that because of whiteness, which has no particular biological fact, the only thing that whiteness does is it colors the appearance. Because of that coloring of appearance, there are certain privileges that people who have that coloring benefit from. It's not that, just because your ancestors, did the wrong thing, you're still benefiting from a system that's designed to benefit people who are white. I think that's what the writer would say. And so she goes on to talk about the fact that America is still pretty much controlled by white, male, middle, and upper class, able-bodied men, and that they are primarily the ones who control most of the decision-making in America. And by virtue of their homogenous grouping, they are deciding and making decisions that affect people of color, and they are exclusive in the way in which they make their decisions. And so sometimes they are not aware of the barriers that people of color face, and they're not necessarily motivated to remove them because they can't even recognize them. And so some of the problems that the author is raising resonated with me, because, simply because there are issues that happen for which decisions are made, and the consequences or the effects of those decisions aren't really fully understood, how they will impact a certain community. So she goes on to talk about in the author's note, she makes another claim that this book is unapologetically rooted in identity politics. And identity politics is a certain politic that benefits a certain group. There are groups who are arranged for socio-political reasons, and they come together to make sure that they can enact certain legislation that benefits their group exclusively. And so she says that she is writing from that vantage point. She says, I am white and am addressing a common white dynamic. I am mainly writing to a white audience, which is also very telling. She's not necessarily writing for the consumption of Black and brown people. She's writing to inform her white brothers and sisters of this thing that she's called white fragility, that it's real. She's writing so that white people might understand and admit and name their advantages, their privileges, and the things that keep them, no matter where they land, on top. And so she really comes at this, I think, in a powerful way to dispel some of the myths and misconceptions about this thing called white privilege and white fragility. So she really just lays this out. She talks about being multiracial and how the idea of being multiracial, some people don't belong to either group, but dominant society will assign them a group by virtue of the color of their skin. So let's take President Barack Obama, who was at least 50% white, 50% Black. His mother was white, his father was African. And dominant society said, well, he's a Black African-American male. Despite the fact that he grew up in a white house and probably identified more with white values, or if there is a term, white values, than Black urban values. Nonetheless, it does not matter what values resonate with you. You are included in either group. If your skin color is brown, then you're automatically lumped in one category. And this sort of racialized understanding is something that does not happen to white people. White people can retain their individuality and not feel like they have to be lumped together in a collective group. But once you see a brown person, they're automatically categorized according to their skin color. And this is some of the things that the writer talks about. She makes a brilliant point to multiracial people, biracial people, that she really has no solution for them. However, she offers this idea of saliency, which really means, whatever is most important to you, that's where you ought to attach meaning. So the salient issues or the salient features of a group is where a multiracial or biracial person should take their solace, instead of being or allowing dominant society to just assign them a place. She offers up this idea of saliency, and we could talk more about that in a few minutes. And then the introduction. And in the introduction, she begins to really introduce the subject of white fragility. And I think she does a fantastic job. She opens up with an excerpt, a description of a training conducted at the behest of an employer. She, a white woman, and a Black woman are conducting the training, and the following is encountered. According to Diangelo, the room is described as full of tension and hostility. Diangelo gives the definition of racism. Whites hold social and institutional power over colored people. And what ensues, as the writer writes, is what she considers white outrage. A man bangs the table and says, white people can't get jobs anymore, despite the fact that the room was overwhelmingly filled with white people, with very few others in the room. That's the opening of her introduction. And it introduces us to a lot of dynamics that are going on even in our world right now, that sort of suggests that white people are experiencing, racism the same as Black and brown people. We have a question?
No.
Okay. This is, kind of stilted. I know because I'm doing all the talking right now, and then Dr. Frazier will pick up as soon as I get done. But I want us to make sure that we are okay. Is there any need to pause or any need to ask a question now?
No one has written a question in the chat bar or raised their hand. If you'd like to ask a question now, feel free to raise your hand or write your question in the chat bar if you prefer that I read it. We just got one comment, a few comments from people agreeing with you.
Okay. So, so in this introduction, and this probably answers the first question that the participant asked earlier. Why should she be guilty for her ancestors' issues? She says white people are separate and benefit from inequality. That's a powerful statement that is convicting. White people are separate and benefit from inequality. So there is the notion that white separation or white exclusion benefits white people exclusively. She says they're insulated from racial stress, yet feel entitled and deserving of the advantages that they realize. So she says their socialization is in superiority, but they're unaware of it, which makes whites fragile about race conversations. That's on page 2. This fragility causes white people's identity to be maintained as good moral folks, but it causes some challenge. It causes defensiveness. It leads to emotional responses, anger, fear, guilt, silence, argumentation, and withdrawal. Emotion soothes and reinstates equilibrium to repel the challenge and restore racial comfort. So anytime, the issue of race comes up, defense mechanisms, according to the writer, kicks in, and that brings about an equilibrium that causes them to be able to either act in a few ways: emotional, or anger, fear, guilt, silence, or withdrawal, and it brings about a level of calm. These emotional responses and reactions are what the writer conceptualizes as white fragility. So this is the definitional term of white fragility: the ability to, basically invalidate, deny, withdraw, or become argumentative, defensive, and just, come away from whatever is causing the angst. And white fragility, as she describes it, seeks to maintain dominance within the racial hierarchy. And this pretty much is really the entree into what it means to operate with white fragility. So I want to leave it there. If someone has a question, we can talk about it. And I want Dr. Frazier to pick it up.
Thank you, Dr. Gerald. That was wonderful, and really kind of creates the opportunity for the foundation to be laid for what the rest of Robin talks about in her book. Chapter 1 really resonated with me as it came from the foreword and the introduction, as you beautifully explained it. I understand this idea of the challenge of appreciating, as a white woman and as a white person, the reality that I don't have to think about that. I don't have to pay attention to that. It just is. And I grew up in Western New York. And I have to say, there was one African-American woman in my grade that I went through high school with, and we had probably about 300 students in my graduating class. So my exposure, my experience was very limited. And I was pretty much a girl of, the 60s, and there were other things to be focused on. But when I went to college, my experience, and I think my education, the basis of it, and I believe that, we learn what we need to learn when we need to learn it, and when God divines that now it's your turn to get uncomfortable. As was noted before in my bio, I am a social worker, and when I was a senior at the university that I went to in Indiana, I had to do a 1-year-long internship. And that internship, as you heard, was in Gary, Indiana, which is where I ended up working after my internship for another almost 7 years. What I didn't know, and again, coming from Western New York, is that Gary, Indiana was at that time a city that had declined rapidly when the mills started closing on Lake Michigan And Gary was right there in the middle of all of it. And it's a steel town. There were a lot of people from the South that came up, a lot of African-American, Black people from the South that needed jobs. And that city was dynamic. It was rich with culture. And we know some of that over the decades, the culture that's come out of Gary, and the people that have come out of Gary that are people that have influenced the lives of many of us over the decades. So when I went there, I had classmates at school in Valparaiso saying, "Aren't you afraid?" And I'm like totally blown away. I said, what am I afraid of? I'm going to, do my internship and learn how to do what I'm learning in class. And they said, "Oh, I guess you don't know about it." And these were more local people. So I said, I'm just interested in getting my feet wet, getting on the ground and doing what I'm going to do. The agency I worked in was a multi-service agency. It provided services for daycare, youth programs, summer camps, senior citizens. It ran the gamut. So it was a service program that served all the community. I didn't know what I was supposed to be nervous about, but I got nervous when I got off the highway and was driving on the main street to go into the agency. And it became very clear to me that I was, for the first time in my life, aware that I was different. I was a minority. I was white. And it was just one of those experiences, as Robin talks about in the book, that most of us never have. We never have the opportunity for that kind of an education. And I thank God even today that I had that opportunity, and not only did I learn about myself, I was able to learn about people that I had never had the opportunity to experience and get to know as people. And what I realized is that I had an experience that, as Robin said in the book and talks about it several times, is we don't see ourselves as whatever it is we are, and as white people in particular, but in general, I don't look at myself in the mirror except when I get up in the morning and have to brush my teeth, and then I'm on my way. So I don't see the reflection of what other people see, or I didn't. I do now. I'm very, very mindful of it. But I went into, after the daycare program breakfast, I went into the ladies' room at this agency, and I used the facilities and was washing my hands, and I looked in the mirror, and I shared this before with Michael and Omayra. I looked in the mirror and I said, "Oh my goodness, what's wrong with you? You look so pale. Am I sick? Seriously." And it took me really close to a minute to unpack that and say, "Oh my goodness, I know why I'm looking at myself like this, because I'm looking at all these beautiful shades of black and brown, and I'm the one that is, looking pretty pale and pasty." And from that day on, I was able to really appreciate that I had something that other people were looking at that I didn't have to see. But I embraced it, and I allowed myself to recognize that there was this reality, this difference. Prior to that, I would have been aghast to see myself as someone that was different. I was who I was. And I think that differentiator with people that have privilege, that don't realize, and I didn't grow up in a rich household, but we had what we needed, and everything, was as it was. We went to church. But I think the reality of what Robin shared about our ability to look at ourselves, and she recalls this, she says, "We don't see ourselves in racial terms, for sure, And sometimes we even, if we do, we forget because we are not reminded of that in so many different ways. And the other point she made is that we don't see each other, we don't see ourselves as others see us. And for me, I think that was a big takeaway from this when we talk about white fragility. Because if I'm honest and I think about what I look like, where I am, and how other people see me, I realize how I feel different, how I feel not fragile necessarily, but more mindful of what other people are seeing when they see me. So when we come to understand that who we are is not necessarily who other people see us to be, because we can't see what they see, it provides, I believe, an opening in our mind and in our hearts that allows us to read this book and to embrace some of the things that somebody else might be very resistant to engaging my thoughts in it and really embracing the reality of what she has been able to put on paper. She says, this is a very important piece too. She says, we come to understand who we are by understanding who we are not.
Is discussing
that color blindness and perhaps the lack of willingness to view ourselves through the eyes of others is a very powerful reality for those of us that have not ever had to go through that experience before. And I think she does a fabulous job of talking about that. And so much of the socialization that is part of that, we take for granted. We don't realize this ideology of the Western world is that we're individuals and we have objectivity. And the reality is there's so much more behind that, that we as particularly people that are white have to be accountable for and have to take responsibility and say, I need to allow myself to ask the questions that everybody wants to ask when there's issues in the world of other people, and why do they do this, and what is motivating them. Do we ever have to ask ourselves that same question? Or do we ever want to ask ourselves that same question? The other point that she made is the race relevant matter. And again, given the experiences I've had, both as a younger person and as a faculty member teaching students from all over the world, race does matter. And we have to make sure that we honor that and are willing to talk about it. I think sometimes the fear is that because we don't know what we don't know, we're afraid to step into that reality or that conversation. And really, again, I think what I allowed myself to do was demonstrate my ignorance. And if there was a student from another country learning the language of English and asking me questions, I would ask them questions and ask them to help educate me about where they come from and who they are, that their ethnicity, their race, who they are mattered to me. And again, you have to be conscious of that in order to be able to take those steps. But it's an important thing for us as people, world together, and especially in the world we're in now, to be able to do that so that we're all growing and have the compassion that we need to have as we're negotiating a world that we're all living in and we're all struggling in, and to be able to lean on each other. And that's, again, a big reach. The other thing.
Dr. Fraser, there's a question for you. The person asks, how do I do what you're saying when all of the white people around me get angry if I even bring up the issue of racism?
That's a great question, because we do get intimidated easily by other people. But I think how we do it is to listen not externally to what other people are saying or reporting back to us, but listen to what's inside your heart and what causes you to feel like you're contributing to your growth and the growth of others. And honestly, I believe that's what all of us are called to do, regardless of what our education is, regardless of where we work, you know, who our family is, where we came from. We are in this world, and I think we're in communities, and we live in communities where we have opportunities. And if we take advantage of those opportunities, a community becomes an extension of our family. And that's why I do it. And that's why I think others could and should be motivated to do that, is the extension of family, as, you know, for anybody that is, has any basis in a faith belief, is that we are all of the same God, and regardless of what we call it. And therefore, we're called to take care of God's people, our neighbors. And if we have someone that's making an issue of why would we want to, you know, learn about this, or why would we want to be friends with someone, or how do you, you know, you work with someone and be comfortable with them, because that's who I am. And that should be a good enough answer. It's who I am. It's who I want to be. If I'm not that, I'm working at being that.
So we have someone who's raised her hand.
Yes.
Dr. Kara Cronin, you have a question, unmute yourself and you can ask it or a comment.
Hi, you know, I just wanted to piggyback on something that Dr. Frazier said from the last question, you know, about this community being the extension of family. I think family has so much to do with this. You know, there is a sociologist that Dr. Diangelo mentions in her book. His name is Eduardo Bonilla Silva, and his whole premise is that there is an actual ingrained fear that we have created amongst white families about talking about race. It's something that you actually stop people and say, no, 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 we don't talk about that. It's not okay. And it becomes a dirty word, right? And so children, like, children think of it as a four-letter word. Well, I guess it is a four-letter word, but it creates fear and intimidation, and it becomes like something that we cannot possibly speak about, instead of talking about it all the time and unpacking it for young children who absorb everything and who can really learn very early on how to deal with such deep concepts. It becomes something they never talk about, and it becomes like almost something to be repressed. And I think one of the things that really needs to happen is that that has to happen in schools too, because that is another extension of our community, right, is schools. And one of the things that I'm a professor of education, so I really push the idea. My work is around creating a pipeline of teachers of color, not just to serve students in low-income communities and communities with lots of children of color, but in affluent communities where that you will find very few teachers of color. And so I think one of the things that because teachers of color can talk very openly and freely about race in a way that, or at least can start a conversation. It's not always so easy because sometimes white parents will push back, but there can be more ways of communication around this idea of race in early childhood, so that children become fluent in the language of racial communication, of social justice, you know. And I just would like to see that. That would be something really great.
Thank you. Yes,
absolutely.
Dr. Frazier, there are a couple of other comments. Would it be okay if I read those?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we had a comment from Nancy Height-Nort. She said, I think that descendants of enslaved Africans want whites to acknowledge that the advantages that they have come from the toil of the enslaved. Daryl Taylor says it is very difficult for someone who hasn't experienced real racism to understand what racism is. unless the subject of racism or discrimination is about the Holocaust. There seems to be no interest in white people entertaining the fact that racism exists. And Christopher DiGiorgio, Dr. DiGiorgio, also answered the first question that I asked about why am I responsible for my ancestors' actions? And he said the realization is that we created a society based on racism. We cannot change the past, but we can take responsibility with the future and work of justice and opportunity. And Dr. Renee Howell also says, I do think many white people realize the advantage we have. There are so many places it is totally apparent. What is difficult is in recognizing that this must give up the advantage, that you must give up, sorry. What is difficult is in recognizing this, you must give up the advantage you know you have. You have to really want to move to the greater good rather than the good of you or your immediate family or the group you immediately identify with.
Those are all great, great comments and contributions. I appreciate them. Thank you so much. There are so many people that are like-minded and really want to be able to turn a corner on what is, I think, something that we've struggled with for not just decades, it's been centuries, and it's evident, you know, well before what was going on here in this country, on this land, prior. And I think we do have to be more mindful of, you know, where we've come from and the pressures that, you know, are kind of pushed upon us to behave a certain way or to have certain kinds of people in our lives. Those are all the realities of, you know, I think this idea of white fragility. And, you know, if you step out of those boundaries, what does that mean for me? And, you know, I'm not comfortable with that. So I'm kind of picking and choosing pieces out of chapters. And I want to get on to chapter 2 and really talk a little bit about this idea of racism and white supremacy, and that where that takes us. And, you know, so often discussions come to this idea of genetics, and genetics, you know, and how it reinforces or supports racism. And again, you know, to come back to this idea of race and the white versus, you know, the myriad of colors that we have, or this idea of gender and, you know, the males and the females, and, you know, the discrimination that continues now in many cases underground, but it's still very evident. And one of the things that she talks about is the distinct biological and genetic differences between the races. They don't exist. And she says that very emphatically. Biological and genetic differences between races do not exist. The issues around texture of the hair and color of hair and eye shape, color of the skin, people's abilities, whether it's being able to play music or be a great athlete, all of those are all under the same skin of all of us. The difference is who has the opportunities or who has the privilege, if you will, of using those to advantage the individual. And in that case, that's where the issue of difference takes place, and the kind of racism and fear that is fraught in so many people. You know, if you know what will happen if our community becomes more African American or Black residents than it is white? What's going to happen to, you know, my property value? And we bring it down to such granular, personal, and survival issues and realities. And again, I think those are forms of deflecting, and they're forms of protecting. that she talks about throughout her book, and the fragility of white people to confront the fears that they have and to be able to allow themselves to move through them rather than to be stuck in them.
There's a question for you that I missed. While at the center in Gary, did others call out your whiteness?
Yes, in very different ways, but yes, it did get called out. And I had a wonderful group of supervisors and mentors as I was a student. I was 20, 21 years old going into this experience, and very fair skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair at the time. And I was an anomaly to the children. They wanted, they wanted to touch me. They wanted to feel my hair. And those are things that as it was unfolding, was getting an education I didn't think I would get. But there were also times when, I'll give you an example. One of the centers had a youth leadership program after school and during the summer. And one of the programs that we had, it's called Officer Friendly, and he would come and talk with the children about, being safe and how to take care of themselves, if stranger danger and all of those things. And interestingly, he was a white police officer. After the program was over and the kids left, and basically at the time I was a bit naive, but I realized he was hitting on me. And I'm like, really? Like, what is wrong with you? Like, I was appalled, I was disgusted. And, there was never any time when anybody made me feel uncomfortable, except that gentleman. I had my own car, and when I was leaving the agency in the winter, my battery had died. It wasn't such a great car, but it got me where I needed to go. And the gentlemen that did maintenance at the facility in the evening were right there. They pushed the car, got it hooked up to a battery of somebody else's car, and got my car started, as if I was their little sister and they were protecting me. And a lot of the people in the agency did feel like they needed to protect me, because I didn't realize what I didn't realize. And I learned a lot after being a student there and then being an employee there, and being a part of the community and feeling and never feeling like anyone would do anything to compromise the work that I was doing. So it was an interesting experience in education, but I would have to say again, it was my white family, colleagues, alum from school. They said, "You're still there? What are you doing in Gary, Indiana?" I said, "I love it. It's like home." And it really was. I lived there, and I go back to visit because there are people there that are still very important to me and part of, quote unquote, my family. So, but I'm very conscious that, I don't blend, and I don't try to blend, and I don't try to be somebody I'm not. And those are all things that show, from my experience, show the kind of respect that people want, that they're looking for and appreciate. That I'm not patronizing, I'm not, stereotyping, and that, I don't know, that was just who I was. I didn't know better, and I'm glad I didn't know better. So it was an education, and one that has carried me, and I think carried my own children through their own experiences. I have to tell you, I digress a little bit. As you heard, all my children went through Tuckahoe schools, and they, and I don't know if this is unique to Tuckahoe, but they have friends that they grew up with and remained friends when they all went off to college and, you know, started getting jobs. Their core friend groups are still their friends from high school, that they are like sisters and brothers. And, you know, Tuckahoe High School is a very diverse population. And they are, again, I think they were educated in a way that helped them see that they're no better, no different, and they can learn from each other different things. And that's what I heard a lot, you know, and the exploring, you know, exploring college students, with students from all over the world. And I think that kids were comfortable asking students questions about where they come from, if they were Indian or if they were from South America or Africa, Ethiopia. And so they were part of the family and in our home as a result of, you know, my experience and then my opportunities in my work. And so I wouldn't say that my kids are colorblind at all, but they're also very balanced in terms of appreciation for what differences people bring to their relationships or their jobs or their experiences that continue to help them grow and them learn. And ultimately, I think that's the piece that, you know, Robin tries to get at, and that I think gets lost in so much of what she's saying in her book, is we need to know what we don't know. And the problem is we're not always willing to learn. And that's what I believe a big part of what can begin to change that white fragility that we experience to a confidence and a comfort with people from all walks of life. But especially, I think, you know, where the biggest rub is with the Black families and individuals and people that we just can't seem to see ourselves in a new light. But it takes, go ahead, I'm sorry, Myra.
I was going to say we're at the 8 o'clock mark. I would like to read a few more comments and then let you get started with, I guess, chapters 2 and whatever we can get through.
Okay.
We have a comment from Lori Gerald. We are all part of one race, the human race. Chris DeGiorgio added, always speak from the heart. I guess in response to the question, what do we say to people around us? Always speak from the heart. Tell me more. What makes you uncomfortable about this subject? Marianne Bateman asked, who here is familiar with the 1619 project? It should be core curriculum in the school systems. Eileen Justino says, we can't change the past. Our history is part of who we are, but what we can do is find solutions. I think too often we talk about the issue without discussing the solutions. Christopher agrees. Part of the solution is our own internal work. This book really talks about what is our own internal realizations. Christine Bangs says, for me, it's becoming clear that an important first step is the inner work and introspection. How many of us have sat down and asked about our own relationship to race and our own racial identity? Enough. Michael Gerald, not to be confused with Reverend Dr. Michael Gerald. This is Reverend Dr. Michael Gerald's daughter, Michael Gerald. She says, as a medical student, it infuriates me when the concept of race is utilized as a biological marker, i.e. race-based medicine. Geography is the major contributor to genetic differences, not the color of your skin. The thought of race being a biological distinction between those of different hues explains why so many health disparities exist, plus racism and mistreatment of Black and brown communities, of course. Daryl Taylor says systemic racism is grounded in the history of our laws and institutions, which were created on a foundation of white supremacy. It causes widespread harm and disadvantages in access and opportunity. Thank you, everyone, for your comments.
Yes, thank you. Very thoughtful. So try to move into chapter 2 with racism and white supremacy. And I think she starts out by being very clear that we're taught to believe that there are distinct biological and genetic differences between race. And as we know, that is not the case. And this idea of race, as she states, is like gender. It's a social construct. It's something that has been socially branded, and the roots go deep then, and the ability then to not see the true person. All we see is the color. And she talks about that in terms of, again, white supremacy. And, you know, if I'm not stepping on someone else's head, they're going to be stepping on mine. And I think historically, because of white population of people have stood on heads for centuries, that's what we do. That's what we are. And again, that is totally part of that fragility now that we look at, we deal with, and we try to understand as we look at the world that we're in today and the kinds of things that have happened, and movements like Black Lives Matter, which is so critical. One of my former students from Concordia is the president of the New York City chapter of Black Lives Matter. And he's been on campus and he's spoken. And it's been so good for many of our white students to see an alum and hear that person's experience, and as a student, and then as an individual who's doing something that is very meaningful. And it turns their head a little bit. It makes them think about, well, you know, we are connected. So finding, I think also that idea of finding ways to connect ourselves to people rather than skin color, rather than, you know, the racial differences that we experience over history, to be able to put that aside and say, this is my friend. And if you don't want to go to dinner with us because you're uncomfortable, you lose out. You know, we have to make more firm decisions about what it is that we want, and not worry so much about what other people are going to say or what they're going to think. And that's a tough one for many people to get past. Is, you know, we want people to like us. We want to be seen as someone that is affirming, and we can't live in both worlds. We have to, you know, pick a lane and get in it and start going. I made a note from what she was saying also, is that our sinful human nature as human beings is deeply part of how we see ourselves in relation to others. That because we are so broken, and it's our sinful nature, and that's not making an excuse, but that's saying, understand that then. And if you find that you have a deep faith and are connected to some kind of religious organization, and that you have this deep faith, then live it. And the deep faith that you live is one where God loves all his children. But again, you know, what does that do to those of us who identify as being the haves, and we want to keep it that way? So the struggle that we go through, and this idea that she talks about around racism and white supremacy, is this love and hate relationship, the duality that exists, which is it's sad. It's very sad.
There's a question.
Yes.
The question is actually for Dr. Gerald. They
Mhm.
asked if he could answer, can Black people be racist?
Everybody has the capacity of being racist, absolutely. Being racist is, you know, doing anything that, you know, out of spite or objection for the other. I think one of the misconceptions is that because of the institutional power of racism. Black people and people of color can be racist, can have prejudicial misgivings or biases against other folks, but they don't have the power to enact racism. And racism means that you have the power to oppress, because you hold institutional and structural power. And so in many ways, Black people can exercise ideas of, disdain or dislike, or, they can even exclude. But, it does very little by way of oppressing others. And sometimes we are, oppressive towards people of our own culture and own race more than we are towards, the dominant culture. So yes.
There's another question for you, Dr. Frazier. Can you describe the difference between white privilege and white supremacy?
Well, there's a fine line between that, and most of that is how one intellectually and emotionally sees that for themselves. So white supremacy, in my estimation, is a much more radical place to be.
And the question is also for both Dr. Frazier and Gerald.
Well, I think white supremacy is really the foundational principles that this country was built on, and that's because of slavery. Everything that happened as a consequence of slavery initiated this whole idea of race to substantiate, holding people in slavery. And the benefits of the white collective, the control of commerce, economics, banking, all of the major systems of power have been established to maintain a benefit for white people. Now, white supremacy is the vehicle or the engine. White privilege are the benefits that come from the engine. And so, as Ta-Nehisi Coates says, race is the parent of racism, not the child, right? So, or is something like that. He said something like that. Anyway, the fact of the matter is that white supremacy produces the benefits of white privilege. And so I may not see myself as a white supremacist, right? But I benefit from the structural power of white supremacy. It benefits people of this collective. So that's how I understand the difference between white supremacy and white privilege.
There's another question. Do you think, this is from Matt Engelbert, do you think racism hurts white people? Many white people feel threatened discussing and recognizing racism because they feel they will lose something. If we can convince them that they win with less racism, the society wins. They'll be more open to the idea. So do you think racism hurts white people?
Yes, absolutely. Listen, anytime we oppress people, we oppress ourselves. So think for just one moment, is it really a good idea that we have ghettos all over this country and prisons all over this country? What would happen if we really poured into each individual the same amount of opportunity? How much more benefit and value would we get as a society? How many new inventions? We would not be lagging behind China or Japan in terms of creativity. We have some brilliant minds in the urban centers who, could come up with cures for any number of diseases, or the next patent for the next big thing. But instead, we choose to wield institutional power to oppress folks, as opposed to lift up those young people, those folks who are struggling. I think if we really examined how this country works, we would see that it would cost less money and benefit the country more if we had less racism. So racism hurts the person who enacts it and the person who's burdened by it.
We have a comment from Lori Gerald, which, by the way, Lori, you can unmute yourself. She is a newly elected school board member. And I believe, if I'm correct, Lori is the first woman of color that's been voted onto the board in Tuckahoe.
Unbelievable, right? In 2020, unbelievable. Hi, everyone. I wanted to say that was a great segue into education. Many of our children come from homes where they're hearing all sorts of things, from their parents. They're hearing words that, they wouldn't necessarily be brave enough to really say out loud. And school is the place where they have to come, and now they have to engage in relationships or programming or whatever with people who do not look like them. And so I often hear people say, oh, schools need to teach this. We need to do this in schools. The kids need to do that. The fact of the matter is that all that starts at home. I started out teaching many years ago preschool. And I can tell you that when children are little people, real tiny, tiny guys and girls, they don't care what color their buddy or their friend is. They don't care. They just play. They have a common interest, a common focus, and that's all that matters. And they are playing and engaging. What happens is they then go home, and as they grow, they're hearing all of these things, and then that resonates and travels over into our school environments. I think where our education systems have the duty and responsibility to do is not to perpetuate racism and discrimination within the confines of education. And that would mean looking at our curriculum to see how our curriculum is being put out there for our kids to learn. Someone in this conversation tonight mentioned the 1619 project. I'm currently in a doctoral program now. Soon, in the next several months, I'll be defending. And I was amazed that people in my doctoral program had no idea prior to the president going to Oklahoma for a rally on the eve of the 1619 Project Massacre. They didn't even know prior to that what 1619 is. Now that's a problem, because these are grown people. And they should know what the 1619 Project, but they haven't had to know. It probably has not been something that has been taught within the education system that we have our children in. That's problematic, and that is something that I will be focusing greatly during, focusing on within my tenure here on the board. We have to, the part of change is education. And so if we don't do that, then we're all at a disadvantage, as Reverend Gerald just said. We are all at a disadvantage. The good news is, and what I get inspired by, is seeing the current movement we have with Black Lives Matter, and the ethnic diversity and the racial diversity, old and young, and it's incredible to see. I never thought in my lifetime I would see that sort of activism and so many people come together for one cause. because they see. And I think that more and more our young people today are not subscribing to the same things that we have subscribed to in the past. They are looking to move forward, and either we're going to travel with them or we're going to be left behind, because the world is becoming more brown. I think there's a book called The Tanning of America. The world is becoming more brown. And so we need to figure out ways that we can come together as one race, as I said in the chat, and that's the human race, because we all benefit from the beauty of diversity.
So Doctors Fraser and Gerald, we're at 8:20. Yes, but you know, it's our first day, so it's okay. We will.
It's wonderful, actually, Omayra. It really is.
It's great. So I will let you guys spend the next 10 minutes however you choose. If you want to continue with some of the chapter information, we can always carry that over to the next one and work.
I think the only other thing I wanted to highlight in the second chapter was the metaphor of the bird cage. If you haven't really read it, and you might need to read it a couple times over to really appreciate that metaphor. It's so powerful.
Yeah. It's a powerful metaphor. Yeah, there's so much about this book that is, instructive for us in building our capacity for community. And, sometimes we get caught up in our particular silos or our particular groups, our cliques, our clubs, and we suffer what one of my favorite theologians calls groupthink. And we tend to begin to behave and think in ways of the group and how the group dynamic is formed. And I think it's very, very important for us to live in space where we challenge notions that are racist and that we know are racist, whether we're Black or other. We need to call out that kind of disparate treatment, because it offends not only the person who is the subject of whatever comment, it also offends your dignity. And so if you are listening to or participating in, water cooler talk, or if you're participating in other groups that are putting down folks, and as Dr. Fraser has hinted at, a lot of the actions of dominant society, particularly as it surrounds white flight, what we call white flight, when Black folks move in, white folks move out. These kinds of things only perpetuate what we are talking about. This idea of separation and domination and control, and this whole thing. And Diangelo hints at it. She talks about the fact that the society is arranged by basically white old men who are making the decisions, and we call that patriarchy. And patriarchy has only served to make sure that this construct stays in place, that power, domination, and control is wielded by men, white men primarily, because even until 1920, white women weren't even really a factor until white men gave them suffrage, which gave them the right to vote. And so, as a society, we have to really, come to grips with the fact that this thing is operative in all of us, you know, and to say that we are colorblind denies the dignity of someone who is brown or black. To say that we, you know, I have a whole lot of friends, you know, that's what we call, you know, avoidance or aversive racism. You know, listen, it is. I think this book, for many reasons, if you read it carefully and if you read it thoroughly, you will have to confront some of your own issues. And, you know, I appreciate this forum because I'm really interested in people being able to reflect on what is being presented and really carefully consider the information. And please don't read any of the Cliff Note versions. There's one out there by Professor McWhorter from Columbia University. I'm convinced he did not read the book. You know, if he read the book, he would not have made the conclusions he's made. I'm saying that because I'm just, you know, I'm tired of apologists for white supremacy, you know, always having umbrage with the fact that someone is brave enough to put information in a book and to tell the truth, because she's violating one of the cardinal rules of white society. White polite society says, don't say anything about this topic. Don't talk about race. Don't call any attention to the fact that you're white. Don't say that you get privileged. Don't let anybody know that there's restrictive codes in Tuckahoe, in Bronxville, that says this house cannot be sold to any person of color today. So these are the things that maintain white supremacy and maintain the standard of white folks. It's not that black folks are ignorant or less capable or less able. It's not even the fact that black folks and Latino folks don't have the money. There are structures in place that prevent us, brown people, from moving up. And that is the truth. And until we really begin to deal with that stuff, you know, we can't have that as my mentor and one of my motivational people have said, we will never achieve the beloved community. And that's what Dr. King spent his life trying to build. And that's what we need to pick up and continue to build.
Amen.
Thank you very much. Any last words, Dr. Frazier, before I close us out?
No, I think we'll leave it with Dr. Gerald's final comments.
So I just want to first thank the library staff. They have just helped put this all together. And no matter what I ask of them and what the village asks of them, they're just always so willing to give and give of their time, give of their talents. So I really want to thank our director at the library, Swadish Pashnanda. Also want to thank Drs. Frazier and Gerald for your insightful contributions to this group. I wish that we had more time. And I also want to thank our village trustee who's joined us, Dr. Renee Howell, who I thought had another event, and she showed up and she made me smile. So thank you for that, Renee. And I also just want to thank all of you who did not, as the Baptists say, count it robbery to be here with us today. I'm not a preacher, but I've heard enough of them say it. So I appreciate that you took the time. I know some of you have small children, have to go to work tomorrow, have other obligations, but thought that this was important enough for us to come together and begin talking about this. So I just want to remind you that we're back here the next 4 Thursdays from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Until September 3rd. So we ask that you would continue in the discussions. We will get a little deeper into some of the information in the chapters, and we'll try to cover as much as we can. So good night, Tuckahoe, and beyond.
Thank you, Omayra. This is a wonderful program. And please check, I'm Elaine Provenzano. I'm
There she is. I didn't see her.
So I just wanted to mention, I want to thank Dr. Omayra, Dr. Frazier, and Dr. Gerald for an amazing forum and for all the comments. This is such an important discussion and a great book. So looking forward to next week. In the meantime, we also have some other great programs for the community. Please check our calendar. And thank you again, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.